every time I read one of my favorite books, there's usually some sort of passage, some sort of section of the book which rattles in my brain more than anything else. That really lingers with me long after I've put down the book. And usually it's a kind of passage that I feel like typifies the style or the themes that makes the book so special to me. So just to give, some examples from other books of what I'm talking about, like the final sentences in The Road, which is like a meditation on the fleeting, ephemeral, delicate nature which was lost in this post-apocalyptic future. Or another example from the book Sutri, also by Cormac McCarthy, where there's this reflection on this the human body and the ephemeral, rotting nature of man, and whose fate is to die and end up as a corpse. So, quote, "Put away these frozen-jawed primates and their annals of ways beset with ultimate dark. What deity in the realms of dementia, what rabid god decocted out of the smoking lobes of hydrophobia could have devised a keeping place for souls so poor as is this flesh, this mocky, worm-bent tabernacle." End quote. So those are just some examples of excerpts from books that to me are like the peak expression of the book. The ultimate expression of the style and the language and the themes and the power that I feel the book captures. And so similarly, the education of Henry Adams has a kind of peak moment like that for me. The piece of the book, the part of the book that I find the most haunting and the most characteristic. And in this case, it's a part of the book towards the middle. Henry Adams is, I believe, 32 years old at this time. He's in his 30s. And he's in England, where he's spent this part of his life traveling and writing. And we know from earlier in the book that he has a deep affection, deep connection with his sister, who he admires, who he describes as just, being brilliant and important to him in many ways. So he writes in this chapter, quote, "He had been some weeks in London when he received a telegram from his brother-in-law at the Bajni de Lucca telling him that his sister had been thrown from a cab and injured, and that he had better come on. He started that night and reached the Bagni di Lucca on the second day. Tetanus had already set in." End quote. Right? So what we're talking about in the 1870s is that there was no vaccination against tetanus. Today every kid has to be vaccinated against tetanus. We have treatments for tetanus. But in those days, if you got a cut, if you just fell, in her case, she fell from a cab, meaning she just fell from a horse, and she got a cut on her foot, and so she contracted tetanus. What we don't really know today, what we're not exposed to today, but what Henry Adams experiences, is that the death from tetanus is a horrible, horrible death, a horrible way to die. So he continues, "The last lesson, the sum and term of education, began then. He had passed through 30 years of rather varied experience without having once felt the shell of custom broken. He had never seen nature, only her surface, the sugar coating that she shows to youth, flung suddenly in his face with the harsh brutality of chance. The terror of the blow stayed by him thenceforth for life, until repetition made it more than the will could struggle with, more than he could call on himself to bear." End quote. And so what he's describing there is this the brutality of chance and this trauma. He's telling us that this leaves a scar on him, a trauma which he will carry for the rest of his life. And he describes it as calling on himself. It's a struggle more than he could call on himself to bear. So really a devastating lifelong trauma. He continues, quote, "He found his sister, a woman of 40, as gay and brilliant in the terrors of lockjaw as she had been in the careless fun of 1859. End quote. So lockjaw and what used to happen when tetanus was something that couldn't be treated. The effect of tetanus is this tightening of the muscles, this clenching of the muscles, which distorts the face and distorts the body and is extremely excruciating and creates this sort of sarcophagus, this locked in experience of being mentally there, but being trapped in a body which you can't control and which is tightening in this horrific way, this grotesque way. So he continues, lying in bed in consequence of a miserable cab accident that had bruised her foot. Hour by hour the muscles grew rigid, while the mind remained bright, until after 10 days of fiendish torture, she died in convulsions. End quote. And just to remind ourselves of how insulated we are nowadays from this kind of death. And it's something which I think it's important not to take for granted. The miracles of modern medicine, the miracles of vaccination. Of course, that's not to say that in the modern world there aren't people who experience the horrors of death. Obviously, there are. Obviously, there are still horrible ways to die in the modern world. And there are still people who die in all sorts of terrible ways. But it's much less common. So we continue. Quote, death took features altogether new to him. In these rich and sensuous surroundings, nature enjoyed it, played with it. The horror added to her charm. She liked the torture and smothered her victim with caresses. Never had one seen her so winning. End quote. And this is just such an amazing, brutal, bitter passage of Henry Adams. This idea of cruel nature taking pleasure in the death of his sister. Never had one seen her so winning. Skipping a bit, he continues, she faced death as women mostly do, bravely and even gaily, racked slowly to unconsciousness, but yielding only to violence, as a soldier sabred in battle. Skipping a bit. For the first time, the stage scenery of the senses collapsed. The human mind felt itself stripped naked, vibrating in a void of shapeless energies, with resistless mass colliding, crushing, wasting, and destroying what these same energies had created and labored from eternity to perfect. Society became fantastic, a vision of pantomime with a mechanical motion. And again, this description of trauma, of just being brought down by the circumstances of life, the horror of what he endured. He says, the human mind felt itself stripped naked, vibrating in a void of shapeless energies. And throughout the book, there's this pattern of using the language of modernity to characterize the psychological aspects of his experience and the philosophical work that he's doing in the book. So he describes all this as, vibrating in a void of shapeless energies with resistless mass colliding, crushing, wasting. So he's drawing from the texts on physics. He's drawing from the texts on mechanics to describe this vision of nature, which is like this horrible machine. He says that social medicine, which is obviously the comforts of friends, is evident artifice. It's useless to him. He continues, stoicism was perhaps the best. Religion was the most human. But the idea that any personal deity could find pleasure or profit in torturing a poor woman by accident with a fiendish cruelty known to man only in perverted and insane temperaments could not be held for a minute. And he continues in this vein, and that's another theme that runs through the book, the fact that Henry Adams rejects religion. There's no place in his heart for this kind of religious loving God that he's been taught and that he recognizes, of course, as his inheritance from his fathers. Henry Adams finishes this section, quote, with nerves strained for the first time beyond their power of tension, he slowly traveled northwards with his friends and stopped for a few days at Ouchy to recover his balance in a new world. For the fantastic mystery of coincidences had made the world, which he thought real, mimic and reproduce the distorted nightmare of his personal horror. He did not know it yet, and he was 20 years in finding it out, but he had need of all the beauty of the lake below and the Alps above to restore the finite to its place. And he goes on to describe the beauty of the scenery in which he's now traveling, and he talks about how nature has this restorative power to him. It's his touring in nature. He describes the white purity of its snows, the splendor of its light, and the infinity of its heavenly place. And so I think that passage just reveals so much about this book and the character Henry Adams, his style, his perspective on life, his way with words, and his struggle, a sense of frustration and protest and disquiet that permeates this book.